Long before the word Philippines was ever spoken, before the islands were charted, named, and claimed, there was already a story in motion. A story hidden in prophecy, waiting in the margins of Scripture. Not at the centers of empire, not carved into marble or written on monuments, but whispered in the edges, among the isles of the sea. The Bible tells us that after the flood, when the ground was still damp with memory, the sons of Noah became the roots of every nation: Shem, Ham, Japheth, and from them, names most of the modern world has forgotten: Gomer, Togarmah, Cush. These weren't just strange syllables buried in ancient texts. They were living bloodlines. They carried tribes over mountains, across rivers, into deserts, and out onto the oceans. They seeded civilizations far from where Noah's Ark had rested. Could one of those almost forgotten names carry the ancestry of the Filipino people? Could the identity of a nation of islands be tied to a lineage recorded in Genesis? What if the DNA in your body holds an echo of a biblical patriarch? That would mean the story of the Philippines does not start in Southeast Asia at all, but at the very beginning of human history. This isn't about politics or nationalism. It's about memory. It's about Scripture that does not just preserve names, but encodes destinies. Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, looks at first like a tedious genealogy, a list you might skim past. But if you stop, you see it's more than a family tree. It's a spiritual map. It shows how nations spread, how languages fractured, how cultures rose and fell. Hidden inside its lines is a phrase almost easy to miss. From these, the coastland peoples spread in their lands. In Hebrew, the word for coastlands is Eim. It doesn't only mean shoreline. It suggests distance, horizons, the far-off places no one had seen yet, the destinations you only find by trusting the wind and the stars. These were not random geographical notes. They were prophetic. They hinted that even the remote islands, the places at the edge of the world, had always been part of God's design. From Japheth came Gomer. From Gomer came Togarmah. His name rarely gets attention. It slips by like a whisper, cloaked in mystery. Yet ancient traditions connect Togarmah's descendants to wandering tribes, coastal people, seafarers. Some say they moved east rather than west. Could it be that the Filipino story traces back here, not through migration charts, but through covenantal memory? Could the root of the islands be hidden in a name the Bible quietly preserved? Every nation has a root. Every people has a name heaven remembers, even when the world forgets. Togarmah, silent, overlooked, almost erased, may hold more weight than we realize. His descendants were not empire builders. They were threshold dwellers, living at the edges of the known world. Ancient records place them near Armenia, the Black Sea, the northern mountains. Others suggest links to nomads, Sakas, and tribes that would one day spread into Asia. Yet the Bible never ties him to a throne or a capital. His name lingers, undefined, as though his people were meant not to dominate the world, but to inhabit its horizons. Some scholars say Togarmah means bone-breaker or strong. Others suggest something softer, stretched, pulled, extended. Perhaps that hints at a destiny, to be drawn out across distances, carried over waters, stretched far from their origin. A people fated not for one homeland, but for many shores. And maybe, just maybe, that path finds its way to the Philippines. When we trace the Austronesian migrations, We don't see armies marching or empires expanding. We see families in canoes, guided only by wind and stars, carving paths across the Pacific. We see quiet courage, generations carrying with them not just tools and food, but songs, memory, and hope. What looks to historians like survival looks in scripture like destiny. If Togarma truly fathered distant peoples, then perhaps his legacy was never about raising walls or towers. Perhaps it was about crossing waters, reaching coastlands, filling the horizons. And if that's the case, then the Filipino story may hold more than culture. It may carry prophecy, because sometimes the names that slip by unnoticed in Scripture are the very ones that echo the loudest. The Austronesian puzzle, the prophetic journey of islands, begins here. The story of the Filipino people is usually told through trade winds and maritime routes, through the branching of languages and the building of boats. But what if those were not accidents of history? What if they were the unfolding of something long spoken, hidden in the geography of Scripture itself? The Austronesian expansion is one of the greatest human migrations ever recorded. From Taiwan to the Philippines, from the Philippines to the furthest edges of the Pacific, entire populations moved by sea, settling thousands of islands. But this was not only survival. It was dispersion, a divine scattering to the very ends of the earth. Isaiah 42 says, "Sing to the Lord a new song, His praise from the ends of the earth, you who go down to the sea, and all that is in it, you islands, and all who live in them." The isles are not forgotten. They are called into the song. They are included in the prophecy. To the Hebrew mind, the isles weren't just coastlands close at hand. They were the unreachable places, the mysterious lands beyond empire. And in that vision, the Philippines, with its thousands of islands, fits perfectly. Far from Babel's towers, far from the palaces of kings, but never far from the voice of God. The Filipino identity has been shaped by centuries of colonial names and foreign borders. But perhaps its truest roots lie deeper, in a spiritual geography older than empires, a geography not drawn by explorers, but by the divine breath that scattered nations and set their boundaries. The Austronesian migrations may not just mirror human instinct. They may mirror prophecy itself, the eastward journey of Japhet's children into the mystery. But the story is more layered still. It does not flow in one direction. There is another stream, one that rises from the south, the sons of Ham. Not all migrations began in the north. Some were born from tribes linked to Ham, Noah's son, whose descendants were too often misread or misrepresented in later theology. Among the earliest known inhabitants of the Philippines were the Negritos, a people with darker skin, Australoid features, and ancient ties reaching back to Africa and Southeast Asia. Their presence predates records. Their story was often erased, yet their survival is a testimony. They stand as a living witness to God's diversity, not as cursed, as false doctrines once claimed, but as vital threads in the human family. Their existence reminds us that sacred lineages are not bound to one color or one shape. The Negritos, the Adas, the Mamanwa, each name is a story, a root in the soil of this land. They invite us to see identity not as division, but as convergence. Could it be that the Filipino people are not the offspring of one line, but the sacred blending of many? Japheth and Ham, north and south, light and shadow, woven together not by chance, but by design. Because Scripture does not erase complexity. It weaves it. Just as man was formed of dust and breath, nations too are formed of many strands. Perhaps the Filipino identity is not found in one ancestor, but in the fusion of several. Prophetic, ocean-born, hidden in the table of nations, yet carried all the way to the farthest seas, not as outsiders, but as living proof that God's purposes stretch to the ends of the earth. And the story doesn't end there. There is still more. A name, a word, a migration pattern that brings this ancestry closer still, to the present moment, to the mirror, to the face you carry. The prophecy of the Isles begins in the language of the Hebrews. In their scriptures, a curious word appears again and again, Iyam. At first glance, it seems simple. Coastlands, islands, the far edges of the map. But the word carries more weight than geography. It hints at mystery, at places distant not only in space but in time, waiting quietly, as if prophecy itself has yet to call them awake. Isaiah writes, "The coastlands wait for his law." Jeremiah commands, "Declare it in the coastlands afar off." Ezekiel mourns, "Judgment shall reach the isles." Line after line, the prophets glance toward the edges of the world. Their tone is haunting, but also hopeful. The isles are not forgotten. They are being prepared. Could it be that among these distant lands the Philippines belongs? A nation stretched across 7,000 islands, scattered by ocean, divided by history, yet somehow bound together by song, by suffering, by faith. A people who have endured waves of colonization, occupation, exile, and yet still rise with prayers on their lips and hymns in their hearts. Could such endurance be more than resilience? Could it be evidence of a spiritual DNA, a hidden inheritance reaching back to Genesis? The Hebrew prophets saw something that empires never understood, that the farthest places are often the ones closest to the heart of God. The islands are not margins, they are altars. They are thresholds where praise can be ignited, where silence waits for its appointed voice. In this light, the Philippines is not a footnote of geography. It is a stage of prophecy, a land waiting not for discovery, but for remembrance. From exile to empire, how the past obscured identity. History remembers conquerors, but it seldom remembers the names they silenced. Before the Philippines was called Las Islas Filipinas, before crowns and crosses redrew its borders, the people here carried identities that no empire could erase. Their tribes, their stories, their gods, their genealogies, woven through song and memory, were a living record. When Spain arrived, it did not only bring new faith and new rule, it brought a great forgetting. Old names were broken down into province names. Deities were reshaped into saints. Oral traditions, rooted in ancestry, were drowned out by sermons and edicts. The people were taught to look westward, to Rome and Madrid for order, to Washington for law. And in the process, whatever echoes of Genesis may have once been remembered were pushed deeper underground. But exile has never erased destiny. Israel in Babylon, Joseph in Egypt, John in Patmos, men and nations forgotten by the world but carried in the memory of God. So too with the Filipino people. Even as new names were forced upon them, their essence endured. A name given by man can never erase a purpose spoken by God. Spiritual signatures in the Filipino soul. Long before colonizers carved borders, before foreign tongues renamed rivers and mountains, the Filipino soul was already marked, not by empire, but by something older, something sacred. There is a tenderness in Filipino culture, a natural hospitality that feels like Abraham welcoming strangers under the oak of Mamre. There is a reverence for the elderly, echoing the commandment to honor father and mother. There is a deep homesickness carried by those who serve in distant lands, a longing for their families and their soil, that whispers of Israel's exile in Babylon. These are not accidents. They are resonances, spiritual imprints. They show that even when history tried to rename and reshape, something in the Filipino soul held steady. A resilience that is more than survival. It is prophetic. Like Joseph singing in Egypt, like Daniel praying in Babylon, the Filipino people have learned to worship in foreign lands, to carry their song into strange soil. This ability is not merely cultural. It is a signpost, a reminder that God's purposes reach into the margins, into the isles, into the lives of those scattered across oceans. The isles may seem forgotten to the world, But to God, they were never out of sight. The Filipino people know how to weep and yet still believe. They know how to kneel, and in that humility, they remember how to rise. In suffering, they find worship. In silence, they carry prayer. Even the language itself holds traces of the sacred. Words that speak of compassion, of honor, of sacrifice. The family is more than a structure. It is a sanctuary. Faith is more than ritual. It is survival. It is breath. This is not merely cultural inheritance. It is a reflection of divine design. A people carried by sea, scattered by history, and yet capable of reflecting the very heart of God. Through music, through memory, through mercy. Because the fingerprints of heaven do not fade, even when touched by empire, even when buried beneath centuries of forgetting, they remain in the soul, in the story, in the sacred call that still echoes across the islands. And if these signatures are real, then we must ask, who wrote them? For what purpose were they always meant to unfold? There is a kind of silence only the islands know. A silence not of absence, but of waiting. A silence that remembers. A silence that carries something sacred through generations. The story of the Filipino people, when traced through Scripture, is more than distant names or long migrations. It is a story of divine memory, a people formed by wind and water, whose ancestry may stretch across oceans and across covenants. If the bloodlines of Japheth and Ham meet in these islands, then perhaps the Philippines is more than a nation of scattered tribes. Perhaps it is a living testimony that God's purposes cannot be confined to borders, nor buried by history. Even the coastlands, the margins of maps, have a role in the unfolding redemption of the world. The genealogies in Genesis were not written to impress historians. They were written because God does not forget names. He does not lose track of tribes. He does not overlook the ones who dwell at the edges. Perhaps that is why the Filipino soul carries both the tenderness of exile and the fire of praise. Perhaps the suffering endured through centuries was never abandonment, but preservation. Perhaps the islands were always meant to echo back the voice that spoke at the beginning, calling every people, every tongue, every nation to remember where they came from, and to awaken to who they are becoming. If this journey has stirred something in you, if you see the fingerprints of Scripture in places you never expected, then walk deeper with us. Like this video if it helped you see the Bible and your history in a new light. Share it with someone who might need to remember their place in God's story. Subscribe to this channel so we can continue uncovering what has been hidden in plain sight. Tell us in the comments what spoke to your heart. Do you carry ancestry that feels both ancient and unnamed? We would be honored to hear your voice, because the story of a people is not finished until it is spoken, and the silence of the isles is finally breaking.